Hey everyone, it's Will here from Singletrack magazine and singletrackworld.com, and I'm here to talk to you about the 2019 Canyon Lux. Now, a few weeks ago I was invited out to Girona in Spain to test out the new Lux. This is Canyon's new lightweight full suspension XC race bike. Now, it replaces the existing Lux in the Canyon lineup, a bike which is coming up to 5 years old this year. The new Lux carries over the 29-inch wheels, 100mm travel front and rear. It's still designed to be a very sharp, lightweight and efficient cross-country race bike, but almost everything has changed. It's entirely new from the ground up. The Lux frame will only be available in carbon fibre. There are no alloy versions available at all. But there are two versions of the carbon fibre frame. Just like other Canyon models, you've got an SL frame and an SLX frame. Now, the SLX uses a slightly lighter weight carbon fibre, and as a result, the whole frame is a little bit lighter. You're talking 1,662 grams is the claimed weight for a medium Lux SLX frame. However, that weight is for the bare frame. Once you add in the rear shock, the remote lockout, the chain guide, through axle, seat collar, and a few other bits of hardware, you're looking at 28 grams, which is not quite as headline grabbing as the original figure, but still very impressive nonetheless. There's some really nice features on the Lux frame, some of which have carried over from other Canyon models and some which are brand new. We've got the impact protection unit up at the headset. The IPU basically stops the headset from over-rotating. So in the event of a crash, your handlebars are limited how far they can turn around, and therefore, hopefully, stop the shifter and brake lever from careering through the top tube, which is quite nice. We've also got the QUIXEL rear axle on the back. So this is boost spacing on the back, and we've got a really neat little integrated axle which just pulls out of the back end and allows you to loosen or tighten the rear axle without any tools, which is quite neat. Another neat feature on the new Lux is the super minimalist chain guide. I think this weighs about 4.2 grams or something like that. It's just a little lightweight alloy guide that bolts into the head of the main pivot bolt. It can be adjusted for different chainring sizes. Very simple, very minimalist, but does the job really well. The main difference with the new Lux frame is, of course, the layout with suspension. Now, Canyon have flipped the rear shock from a vertically mounted shock up to the top tube. And the idea here, aside from performance advantages that it's provided, it also delivers a lot more space inside the main frame. So now, for every single frame size, you can fit 2 full-size water bottles inside the main frame. That goes for the small, medium, large, and extra large frame sizes. For long distance riders and marathon racers, this is a really big deal because it means they can carry 2 water bottles on the frame. For racing, you're less likely to need to stop at a feed zone in order to refill a bottle, grab a fresh one. You can just go straight on through. The suspension design itself has changed considerably. We still have a carbon fiber one-piece swing arm, so there's no pivots at the back. The swing arm is designed to flex through the carbon seat stays as the suspension cycles through its travel. There's 2 little links that drive the rear shock. We've got a carbon fiber yoke which attaches to the lower eyelid of the rear shock, and a little alloy link on the inside which bolts it to the seat tube and controls the link as it goes through the travel. The rear shock itself is a metric size. We've got a 210 by 55mm stroke. Now, that is quite a big shock, especially for a short travel cross-country race bike. With 55mm stroke and 100mm travel, we end up with an average suspension leverage ratio of 1.81 to 1. So very low, and that means we end up with quite low operating pressures. For my 70 kilo rider weight, I had 110 psi in the rear shock to get me at 25% sag. So quite low pressures relative to other cross-country race bikes. The bike that I was riding at the launch is the second from the top. It is called, wait for it, the Lux CF SLX 9.0 Pro Race. Just rolls off the tongue, that one. It's a sub 10 kilogram carbon fiber race whippet. Super light, super trick. We've got a SRAM XX1 Eagle group set on here. We've got a ROCKSHOX suspension package with a SID World Cup fork on the front. Very lightweight Reynolds wheels. These are carbon fiber rims and they weigh less than 1,400 grams for the pair, so very light. Thankfully, a dropper post, which was a very nice addition for the trails that we were riding. So the riding position on the Lux, it is fairly traditional for a cross-country bike. The basic numbers for geometry, we've got a 70-degree head angle and a 74.5-degree seat angle, so quite sharp. The reach on the medium size that I was riding is 435 millimeters. That combined with an 80mm stem, 720mm bars, it does put quite a lot of weight on the front wheel, stretches you out over the cockpit, puts you in a really good position for climbing and getting the power down on the pedals. And in general, this bike, it does pedal very, very well, very efficient. I found it quite an exhausting bike to ride because it encourages you to get out of the saddle and hammer. It really goads you into going faster and just put more effort in. It's not a bike that's really interested in going slowly. It wants you to go fast. So at the end of the day, I was absolutely knackered riding this bike. The suspension design is really efficient, and to be honest, I don't know why Canyon's bothered with a remote lockout on the handlebar. The dual lockout activates both the fork and the shock, but to be honest, this bike doesn't need it. It pedals really, really well as is. If it was my bike, I'd be taking that off straight away, personally. Although the suspension is very, very stable and very balanced under pedaling, it's also still active. So great traction levels on this bike. It actually has quite good big hit capabilities. So I took it off some reasonable sized drops and jumps, and the bike stayed really planted without sort of squirreling about. Yeah, in general, the suspension gives the whole bike a lot of stability and a lot of calmness. So even though those geometry numbers are quite sharp, quality of the rear suspension gives this bike a load more capability and a load more stability than perhaps those geometry numbers would suggest. The fork didn't quite match the quality of the rear suspension. Turns out there weren't any bottomless tokens inside the air spring of the SID forks that we were riding. That's something I would do if I had a bit more time with this bike, is to put a couple of tokens inside there to give it a bit more progression and a bit more ramp up to balance with the rear suspension. But otherwise, I really enjoyed riding this bike, and it surprised me quite a lot with how well it rode on quite rough, rocky terrain that we were riding around Girona. Now, for the 2019 Canyon Lux range, there will be 6 models available. The 2 top-end models will use the lighter weight SLX frame, and the 4 cheaper models will use the SL frame. The SL models will also come with a longer travel fork, 110 millimeters of travel, and that will kick back the angles a little bit, and in theory should relax the steering a little bit, especially for descending. Of note is that any model that comes with a ROCKSHOX fork has a longer 51mm fork offset, whereas the Fox models will come with a shorter 44mm offset. Now, that will give a slightly different steering dynamic. So with the Fox fork models, you are going to get a slightly calmer and more damped steering feel, whereas the ROCKSHOX models, you're going to get that sharper, more responsive feel that you get with a longer offset. So that's something to bear in mind as well. Now, if you'd like to read more about the 2019 Canyon Lux range, make sure you jump on singletrackworld.com. You'll be able to read our full news story on the new bike, as well as my first ride review of this very lightweight, very efficient, and very stealthy full suspension race bike from Canyon. Thanks, guys. THRU.